Time can be a bit odd in fiction. Writers will fracture, reverse or repeat chronologies to make their storytelling more intriguing and interesting for their readers. In this episode, we'll take a journey through time and the ways in which it can work in fiction. Welcome to the Writer's Gym. The Writer's Gym podcast. Build creative confidence and grow your writing life with Rachel Knightley and Emily Inkpen. Rachel Knightley, hello.
Hello.
Emily Inkpen, hello.
Hello.
Our narratives have combined and we are all in the same room at the same time in Reading.
Yes, we are. Yes.
You managed to make that sound like such a downturn in Reading.
Well, I didn't mean
Reading so far.
I didn't mean to diss Reading in that, and especially as it's where Emily lives.
It's Emily Land.
Well, I mean, I wouldn't go as far as to say Emily Land. This house is Emily Land.
Ah, but it's temporarily Emily Land, and you know this house and what is Emily in it goes from place to place through eras.
This is true, and wherever I go. Yes.
And amongst your fractured narratives and repeating timelines.
Reading is for me actually a bit of a liminal space, because the reason we moved here is because it's very easy to get to everywhere else. It's a very well connected town. So it's a great place to live if you go to things in other cities, in other places. And so therefore it's sort of good between spot.
It's the wood between the worlds.
That's
in
what I was
Narnia.
about to say. Yes. Yeah.
Well, writers love a liminal space, don't they?
Absolutely,
but I'd never thought of Reading as being a liminal space. But I think
What, you mean you don't think C.S. Lewis was thinking of Reading when he created the wood between the worlds? Really?
Not especially.
I mean, I find that very surprising.
It's never really occurred to me, but
I've seen guinea pigs walking past with rings attached to them over and over again.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Uncle Andrew wandering past.
Yellow or green rings.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I'm so glad you know that.
Absolutely, I know that.
today on the Writer's Gym, we're going to be talking about the way that time and chronology works in fiction. There's a really famous quote from Doctor Who, where the David Tennant Doctor says, "You see, time isn't linear. It's a big ball of wibbly-wobbly, timey-wimey stuff," which also sounds very Douglas Adams. I think it was actually Stephen Moffat, the writer that came up with that one.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So, Rachel, what thoughts do you have about time in fiction?
Well, after using that quote, it would just be rude not to go back to the fact that the Doctor was having a conversation that had been written down, the other person's part had been written down for him, so he'd worked out his own, because they were going round and round in circles having that conversation from two different eras. And something like Doctor Who gives brilliant opportunities for that, but it doesn't make it any less clever how you take them. And that's a beautiful example to go and watch if you want to look at how time can be used very, very beautifully. That it's science fiction, yes, in parts it's horror, but what it always is our sense of memory and our sense of evolving identity. So Doctor Who had what for me are its best moments, and Blink is certainly one of them. I just went off into my head about how much I love Blink there, but cut that bit out where I just mentally wander off for a minute going, ooh, it's so good.
I'm not going to cut that out.
Okay, no, don't.
I think it makes a very good point.
No, it does make a very good point. Let's see if I can remember what the first really good point was. What I love about how writers can work with time was best said, in my experience, by Maggie O'Farrell, who is one of my favourite novelists, who I know I bring up quite a bit. And when she was asked by an interviewer why her novels were not presented chronologically, she said, because I don't think chronologically is the human experience. I think fragmented, I don't know if she said fragmented, but in a different order is how we experience it. Because if you look at how you've lived your life today, yes, you're in a room with whoever you're in a room with doing whatever you're doing, but at different times, things they say will associate with things other people have said. You'll go off on a mental journey, as I just did with Blink, about something that is important to you. And that really is how we live our lives. So while beginner writers have honestly said to me, and you can hear the cringe as I say this, oh, I'm not presenting the novel or whatever it is chronologically, so I don't need to know the real order it happened in. The answer is yes, of course you do, because that's the way in which the character evolves. But just because you know that doesn't mean it's how you then have to present it. So another of my obvious favourites for that is The Time Traveller's Wife, where when we're in Claire's head at the very beginning and she first meets Henry, she knows everything about their relationship. She knows she is standing in front of the person she considers her soulmate, and he has never met her before. She's just a loony who's wandered into the library. But all of this is coming. And for the different timelines, for their meeting the first and last time at different times, shortly before the Doctor and River Song then have exactly the same thing going on. You know, it doesn't get old, no pun intended. It means that you're seeing fragmentation as the natural order of how we experience our lives, because you know you can see a person or a place and be absolutely catapulted back to how you felt and who you were when that was central to your life, and that is much more emotionally real, I think, than necessarily presenting things in the right order.
Yeah, we sort of live our lives in retrospect, almost, in a way, because in every moment we're thinking about, I mean, like look at what we're doing right now. We are at the moment sitting in my house talking about chronological or not storytelling. But in doing so, we are talking about narratives that we have seen and have read in the past that have informed how we now approach narratives. Everything that we do in the present is influenced by what we've done in the past. Yes. We are not necessarily living things fresh, and that is, I was just thinking, it just made me think of The Notebook, you know, the older lady who has dementia, who is experiencing life in the present. And in the present, she is being told a story about two people. And it's only later when she has a flash of lucidity and comes back to herself and remembers that the entire story is her story and the story of Noah, who's been telling her the story all day, that she is able to live in the past of that story, and she is able to know it and join
bring
all
it
of
into
the
the
dots
present
and bring it into the present and bring the past into the present in that beautiful way. But for the entire story, really, she is living in this moment. She's hearing this story. She doesn't know how significant it is or why. And yeah, it's, you know, we need to be lucid to have context. All people need context.
And in the end, identity and memory, who we are. And something like S.J. Watson, Before I Go to Sleep, where she's losing her memory every single day and she's leaving herself evidence that the person who is presenting themselves as her husband is not her husband and what her real situation is. And I think maybe one of the biggest fears that we have as humans, certainly I have, because when I was first living in England at the age of 2, I lived with my mother and with my grandparents, and my grandmother, who's a very wordy person, was beginning some kind of progressive dementia, and I remember her saying, I will never be able to find words again, and that being the most terrifying thing that she could possibly imagine. So I think, as well as literature having got that memo, I think I very much got that memo early on, that it's probably why I enjoy writing things down, wanting to understand things, wanting to connect with people, because it's all finite. You have a window into things with time. And yes, memory and identity is very much what I feel fiction is exploring, and in a tantalising way making permanent, that we feel like if we do manage to get, as whoever it was said about poetry, the best words in the best order, that is permanent in a way that we are not.
But then it's again why no words are wasted. And if you've written something today that never ends up in the main book, for instance, if we're talking about writing, you have still written those words. You have the experience of writing those words. What you've learned through writing them will come back later. You are laying foundations now for what is to come.
Absolutely.
Yeah. You've both written a lot of fiction that either plays with time or jumps between different parts of time in your worlds. Emily, you have this situation where your novels are set at a different time to your audio drama.
Yeah.
Rachel, your short story cycle jumped around, not through vast
well,
periods of
five
time.
generations.
Yeah. have you used extensive planning, or have you written the bits in one particular time at the same time, or
I
have you
had
worked on
two
it?
post-it notes next to me which had the story titles and the years that they were in, because as anyone who knows me knows, words great, numbers not so much fun. Needed to make sure everything happened in that order, so I kept that with me and did a little bit of jiggling around of that on the post-it notes. But really, for me, the opportunity with that idea, how these 5 generations mess up and light up each other's lives and their misunderstandings about each other. We've talked about point of view in the past, and it was very much that for me, but people change over time, and the other opportunity that gave me is she the central character? There's a familial love triangle of 3 women and their effects on each other at the heart of it, and the matriarch of the family, we meet her at very different stages in her life where certain things are either just opening up or very, very, very closed off. And it allows me to explore the same character. And I suppose in some way a lot of it is a note to self that, like everyone I write, they're an amalgamation of things I've thought about myself and other people. And that matriarch is 3 main other people plus a bit of me, like everyone is a little bit of me. And just how life can alter you and how the memories you're carrying with you affect how you then show up in time in the present. And it allows us to see her behaviour and revisit her behaviour and understand what's going on for everybody and what they misunderstand. And I think where the tragedy comes in for me is the missed opportunities that our perception allows for, where we could have connected but instead we are defensive or whatever is going on for them. And playing around with time is just a delicious way of doing that.
Yeah.
Emily, I suppose you've written stories in different time periods in your world.
Yeah.
I mean, how's that been, jumping between those time periods?
Really challenging for a while, because I've mentioned before that, my novels are set 11 years after the audio drama. And that means that, the novels start when the main characters are 26, 27. The audio drama is when they're 15 and 16. So a while back, I wrote the first novel first and then started working on the audio drama. And in that time, I was working on book 2. And in book 2, they're like 28. And in the audio drama, they're 15. I was having to jump between those 2 time periods, these same characters, completely different points in their lives. I would be going from these complicated adults who have seen everything, and up until that point they are complete within themselves and these extensive life experiences that they've gone through, and then jump back to them at 15 and have to work my way back through those events. I found myself sometimes writing a reaction from Isra, and it's like, well, no, she wouldn't react like that because she hasn't experienced all of these things yet. They are to come. And it's fine, you get around it, but it is hard sometimes because you have to rewind your headspace to settle into where they're at. And writing teenagers is really hard. Writing teenagers like the kids in that story is really hard because they've gone through things that a lot of adults wouldn't have even considered in life. They've not had a typical teenage experience. What is a typical teenage experience? Blah, we could talk about that forever. But, their experiences are very extreme and very adult, yet they are teenagers. So it was really a case of unwinding emotional intelligence and emotional context and, maturity from experience. I'm not framing this particularly well, but it was hard. It was challenging. It was tough at times. And especially when I was tired, this was particularly tricky. Now it's not so bad.
And you were writing these strands at the same time, weren't you?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so that was what was challenging.
And when we were talking before this recording started, we did make the observation that even writers whose narrative is relatively linear, that all the story is set in a traditionally linear chronology, they may jump around as they write it. So they might start with something towards the end of the story, write the beginning at the end. So, as writers, maybe we impose that fractured chronology on ourselves sometimes, don't we?
But in a way we have to, because as humans, the beginning and ending that we don't have a choice about most of the time, not always, is being born and dying. Whereas within stories, we are imposing choice, we are imposing, this is where I see the beginning as, this is where I see the end as. And Pratchett's done that, here's the beginning. Oh no, wait, here's the beginning. Oh no, wait, here's the beginning. It depends where you start looking. And it is all imposed. We are storytelling creatures. We put a narrative on things. What really kind of hammered that home for me was when my main job was leading drama clubs and plays in schools. You could set your watch by the fact that whatever scene you gave most primary school groups, and you said go off and make a scene about this, and they'd do a bit on their own, they would begin it, in the early years, they would begin it by waking up in the morning, and they would end it by going to sleep at night.
Yeah.
Because those are beginning and ending positions that we can all compute.
Yeah.
And that's what the brain does. It finds beginnings and endings. They're more arbitrary than we realise, I think.
Yeah.
So why then do writers like to fracture narratives, tell stories in non-linear manners, and why do readers enjoy that so much, do we think?
The thing that I mentioned Maggie O'Farrell said about this is the human condition, I absolutely subscribe to, but moving it on to what do readers get from it, I think readers, whether it's conscious or not, do instinctively understand that, yes, that is the human experience. I think it works for people because actually it's more honest than going, here is the beginning of this section of someone's life, here is the end of this section of someone's life, and we're not going to go into any of the distant past or the future, we're just going to do this bit. We know that's going to be more limited than if we've got a little bit more freedom around that. So taking one more Maggie O'Farrell example, there is one of her novels that begins where somebody has just tripped over in the street, so we meet them in midair. They've tripped over a paving stone, they're in the air, they're about to fall reasonably nastily onto the pavement because they've fallen over something. So they are literally midair. And they see in the not too distant the man that they're going to end up dating quite soon. So this is how she meets him.
Okay.
And I probably should have mentioned this in the foreshadowing episode because it's not going to be plain sailing, but that's how she meets him. And there's a lot that I think taught me in terms of beginnings are arbitrary. We have been born, we've learnt a lot, some of it good, some of it bad, and we're now living it, and that's going to have its own repercussions. But you've got to, at the risk of sounding a bit glib, you've got to start somewhere.
Yeah. And I think I know some people who write the novel and then go back and write chapter 1 at the end. Because they think, well, I don't know where I'm starting yet, but I know where I've got to get to. So worry about the beginning at the end.
Oh, categorically. Because the thing is, you can't know that the beginning is finished until you know what the whole journey.
Yeah.
You simply can't. I mean, I know I've said it before, but you would never get a painter going, I have to get the first top corner of this picture absolutely finished before I can move on to the next one. And yet, as writers, we've got that temptation to get chapter 1 quote marks right before moving on. And it's, in a way, it's the least useful thing you can do because you can't know if you're going to keep all of that if you don't know what the whole thing is like. So again, with the fractured time, you've got to experience it all.
Or like me, and I wrote my book, submitted to agents, got feedback saying, no, I need more upfront, and had to write, ended up restructuring part 1 of book 1.
So your original chapter 1 might have been chapter 6 in the end.
Yeah, it ended up getting cut because I added so much context, and the characters that came together in chapter 1 in that first draft were on different sides of the planet, actually, in that new, when that event unfolded in the later draft, which was much more likely. The agent at the time said, given how these characters operate, it is very unlikely that they would all be in this one place at this same time. And it's absolutely true. I put them all there because it helped with the plot, but that's not how you want to do it. And so by giving the beginning that extra space, it meant that you knew all of the characters in their place, where they happened to be, and that was much more realistic because they wouldn't have all been in that one place at that time. They wouldn't, not at that point, not given what they've been through in the past and who they are at that time. It wouldn't have happened. So going back, completely rejig the first part. Yeah.
But through getting to know the book better, and you got to know it better, the agent got to know it better. So it's I just feel like I need to stick this health warning on everything I ever say. Don't try and write the final draft before you've written the first one. With your example, Emily, that's how you got to know that world a bit more. I know you did already, but you move through it. We can't know that without writing it.
Get all the pieces of the jigsaw on the table before you start to put it together.
Before you start taking out the scissors and making it into a different jigsaw.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, let's think about some of the ways in which narratives can be fractured in fiction. We'll just use a couple of examples here, and we can think about maybe putting some more in there. So a common one might be that we start a story with an event, and then the rest of the story tells how we reach that event. That might be the classic circular narrative, perhaps. Another interesting one is where we repeat the same events, but from the perspectives of different characters. So we're seeing the same things over and over, but getting different perspectives on them. We look at different narratives or characters at different periods and leave readers intrigued about how they can link up. And probably the most common one, certainly this would have been the case quite a while ago, is that linear structure, the story told in a chronological order, the order in which the events happened. So there's 4 examples of structures. Are there more that you would like to throw in at this point?
I'll throw in a few that just to show I'm not all yay fragmented and boo chronology. I mentioned on an earlier episode that one of my favourite books of all time is Jane Eyre. And what she does is Bildungsroman. She takes the whole story. So we meet you at your youth. We take forward, it's told from the perspective of the adult remembering. And that separate argument that we can have is that, liberties might be taken with the language that the child uses. That's a separate argument. But we see them growing, we see what they've learnt, we see what happens next. Because of the moral dimension with Jane Eyre, because it is very strongly, I am a free being, and you are not going to be able to do anything about that. And she's already got that as a 10-year-old. There's already something in her that gets carried forward, that even as the obstacles get worse and worse, even in the face of death, she is herself first. There's other ways of looking at that, and I know there are, but it does that very successfully. And by starting at the beginning and finishing at as old as she gets within the book, we can see the progress. It makes its point. It is the story of a person. Similarly, if you were to tell Cinderella in retrospect, it probably wouldn't have quite the same effect. I lived happily ever after. Let's look back at when it was rubbish. And
it wasn't always like this, kids.
And don't get me wrong, because there's good examples of that too, but you've got to think, does it serve the story? So I can do examples of the opposite, but I guess I've already fragmented elsewhere, haven't I?
I think so. Now, Emily, your stories tend to be quite linear, don't they, in their storytelling?
I have a timeline, yes. Yeah.
I mean, that's it.
You
seems
said
to
that
me
like I have a cold.
I have a timeline. Yeah. I have a timeline today, and it's not timey-wimey. It's just time. Yeah.
Was there a reason for that? I mean, was that the way that you? I mean, clearly it was the way you thought you could best tell the story.
Yeah. I mean, I was telling a story, and that was how it was coming out. I mean, there would have been no point in messing with that at all. Not in the story that I was telling. These characters go on a journey, and as the reader, you are with them through that process, and seeing a snapshot of where they are going to end up later. It's not. I have a bit of a problem with this because obviously the audio drama is set before, and so book 1 of the trilogy, which is set 11 years later, is technically still in publisher submission. It's been a couple of years now. I'm not holding out any hope, but at the same time, I'm now thinking that I don't necessarily want it to be published now, because spoiler alert, 11 years later, there is something to be said for the fact that actually it would be cool if we got the audio drama to a certain point and then released the novels, because then it would be a what comes next. And that would be potentially more powerful than releasing the novels now and being like, oh, and by the way, in 11 years' time, this happens. You know, and I don't think, right, while some stories could really thrive on something like that, with the Dex legacy, I think actually it would take from the journey that the listeners are going on with those characters. It is definitely a building of character and story through all of these adverse events that they face together. You sort of watch the layers of the onion build up around them, and that's sort of a process that's ongoing, and yeah, you can go back and then find what was at the heart of it, whatever. There are some stories that absolutely work. I mean, you mentioned about starting at the end and then having a sort of, so here, how did we get here? Snatch, for instance. Guy Ritchie, absolute classic example. You know, the opening scene is the two main characters sitting in a dodgy jeweller's with a diamond that's being valued, and nobody's looking very comfortable, and they're all sort of like, what are we doing here? And he's like, you might wonder how we ended up like this. And you do, and it tells the whole story. But then there's also a famous sequence there where all of the different characters who seem very disconnected throughout the story come together in one sequence driving along a street where one of them's having a conversation, throws a carton of milk out the window, and it hits another car on a car that the other characters are driving, and then they have a car accident. But it all happens the other way around. So we start out with the characters behind, the milk hits the window screen, they go off and drive off, and then things happen. Then we're with the characters who then throw the thing out the window. It all comes together in this moment that is really a sort of climax to the story in a way. And it's very entertaining and very well done.
And I'm just in my head now seeing Gene Wilder standing on that windowsill at the beginning of The Woman in Red with the voiceover going, how did I get here? I was so sensibly jobbed and married and this, that and the other. And now I am standing on the outside of a hotel and people are starting to look up wondering what I'm doing. And you work back through how he's dismantled his life in a week or however long it was.
But then you also mentioned stories that are one person's perspective and then another person's perspective. You get that in The After Party on Netflix, which I think I've mentioned before, because they also did it in different genres in season 2, which was lovely. But it's the whodunit, isn't it? It's the classic. And in Spectacles, you know, this woman committed suicide. Who was responsible? Well, everyone in this room was responsible. Here's a bit of the story where you came in. Here's a bit of the story where you came in. You all contributed to this woman's life derailing and spiralling.
And then by not showing the photo to any of them and then realising that when he's gone, letting the audience realise it is not just about these characters, that is all of us.
And exactly.
Using that device anywhere is brilliant, because I guess that's another reason that fragmentation, because that is an example of fragmentation, because we go back into those stories, absolutely, you know, it reminds us that we are all connected, that we are all affecting each other every single day, that no story is a done deal. It's a beautifully conceived play. All these different ways of storytelling and different ways of affecting the reader or the viewer or whatever you want to, you know, however you want to deal with it. I mean, like past into present. I'm just looking at my shelf. Rebecca, Daphne du Maurier. And the sort of finding out the past through the present and but also just seeing yourself and not what's around you, that it was all her fears, it was all what the worst version that she thought what was around her could mean, that the Gothic is starting in our heads. But also, just because you were talking about Priestley, you know, the other time plays, the idea of messing about with time and seeing different versions. And I know we came in with this with Doctor Who. For me, it's also about that sense of possibility, that yes, time could go this way, but you are alive today, person finishing this book, person walking out of this play, and seeing those different versions or seeing how people are different in different times does connect you with that sense of presence, I think, that you are here now.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And the preciousness of the present. I know someone who writes a lot about time. It's called Fraser Armitage. He's, written a few really, really into time and playing with time, high concept stuff. And a lot of his writing comes back to you can't change things. And the present is the present for a reason. Things go wrong when you try and mess with that, which is...
Or when you try and live in what's already happened rather than what you can still make happen.
Yeah, exactly.
And it would be wrong to say on a writing or wrong not to say on a writing podcast. I think Fraser will have made a very difficult job for himself, certainly in that debut novel where there was the opportunity to change time.
Yes.
You could have things never have happened. But how do you cope with that?
Yes, tomorrow.
Yes, I think that was what it was called, wasn't it? But the point I was going to come on to next really was that if we are going to play around with narratives and fracture them, that implies a bit more work in the planning stage for writers, but also a bit more jeopardy in that there is a greater risk, I think, of inconsistencies when you start to fracture a narrative. I mean, first of all, Rachel, do you think that's right, that there is that greater risk? And how, if there is, how would a writer cope with that?
With dubious relevance, the first thing that comes to my head is the Red Dwarf episode, The Inquisitor, where the Inquisitor goes through time and judges all of you on your own standards on whether you have made the best of your life according to you. And two of the cast get zapped out of existence and try and fight their way back in, and listen, so we don't exist anymore. And Crichton says something along the lines of, actually, sir, we don't ever have existed before, although this is not the time to be conjugating verbs in the past and possible never tense. And the reason I bring that up, other than that I really, really enjoy it, is I think the question that these things are all asking is your own sense of, have I used what I have and how else could that have happened? And that can make you live in the past rather than do the thing that the whole thing's about, which is work out what to do in the present and the future. I think where your question comes into that for me is, if you've got an idea in your head, you need to follow it. To say that something isn't worth doing before you've done it is to not write the first draft. And the only thing that will happen based on making a decision that it's not worth it when you haven't done it is, okay, fine, you won't do it. The universe will not give you a detention, but the world will not have that book. So my response to that is, if it's in your head, get it out of your head and onto a page. Regardless of how difficult something is to do well. Anything done well takes more effort than the person reading it is going to spot, because that's what effortless means. It doesn't mean you haven't put effort in. It means that you have smoothed it all out very nicely after a lot of effort.
Yeah, you've made the effort look effortless.
Yes. That's why when people say, oh, it was such an easy read, and they don't always hear what they are saying. I mean, they don't listen to a symphony and go, oh, it was such an easy listen. All the notes were in the right place.
There is this inherent idea that certain things are hard and certain things are easy. The idea that children's books are easy to write because there are few words and simple stories. No, they are actually some of the hardest things to write, because you have so many things to bear in mind. It's an art in itself, and it can take a long time to write a good children's book. It's not something to be taken lightly. I mean, I remember working as a copywriter, and the golden rule that I used to say over and over again is, this thing is too easy to read, said no one ever. Nobody complains about being too easy. You've got to make things easy to understand. You've got to get to the point where it feels effortless to read, or at least this is my aim. Like, I love a sort of complicated, there's certain books that are delicious in the complexity of how they're written, and you can sort of bask in the way they paint pictures through incredibly beautiful words and their use of language and everything. But when I am reading those books, I am conscious of the fact that I am reading those books, if that makes sense. When I'm reading a book that is written in pretty plain English, I am living the book, because I'm not seeing the words anymore. They're all words that I use every single day, and whatever, they disappear. Those words disappear. The images and everything else take over. When I'm reading words that I don't say every single day and that are exciting as words and that are pleasant as words, suddenly I'm in the moment reading the words. And it's a very different experience. So I can appreciate both. But I think there is a place for both. And this is now a very different podcast. But
which we will note down and have.
Yes, absolutely.
And I was thinking along one of your answers in particular, I think, this other concept of many worlds, the Philip Pullman's books.
And the Trousers of Time.
And the Trousers of Time can jump between worlds. Sliding Doors was an example of, what if this and maybe there's another world in which...
And Time and the Conways, I think, going back to Priestley.
But those stories need not necessarily be in different times, but they are in different worlds, which is definitely another podcast. They are a cousin of the messing around with time narrative things, aren't they? Definitely.
An absolute gem of a book, Beauty by Sherry S. Tepper. Absolutely fantastic. It takes fairy tales and makes a lot of fun of them, but it's about beauty in the Sleeping Beauty myth or fairy tale, and she chooses to not go to sleep but go time travelling instead. I think she actually fakes her sleep via someone else. She puts someone in her place and then goes off and does something else instead. And it's actually travelling through time, and she ends up within different fairy tales and realises the role she's playing in the fairy tales and therefore what she needs to do to make that fairy tale come about. So it's all of the fairy tales coming together in this sort of fractured way, and she is in all of them at different places in time, and she time travels to future places and past places. It's a beautiful, beautiful book. I recommend it to everyone. Really.
We'll print a link in our show notes as always. So we're coming towards the end of this discussion about different narratives and timelines in your writing. Rachel, do you have an exercise about chronologies?
I have an exercise about chronologies, yes. This week, I dare you to create a scene where a character is thinking about another character, and a scene where they are face to face with that character. It might be that the first one, they really like what they're remembering, or that they're really angry about what they're remembering, but they're thinking about that person when the person isn't there. And then one where they are there. And this will explore different versions of that relationship, and it will also show you different things about the character who is doing the thinking and doing the living. And maybe these are decades apart, or maybe they are nanoseconds apart. Maybe it's before you turn the corner to meet the person you're dating, or maybe it's remembering a grandparent and then we flash back and see the reality and how it was like the memory and how it wasn't.
Well, that sounds like a very intriguing exercise. I just thought I'd give you an opportunity, both actually, to share a bit of advice, maybe for people who are going to undertake that exercise or challenge, but writers wishing to start to experiment with other storytelling chronologies, structures, systems than those that they've previously used. What advice would you offer to a writer wishing to have a go at some other time structure?
So my job involves never being caught giving advice, so I'm certainly not going to label it that way. What I will always do is find out what is going to make that person curious, get more specific about what it is they want to do with their writing, and that is where they build their confidence, and that is when they are curious, and then they do more muscle building in the writing. So that is just a little bit of pedantry to start with, and here is the advice I'm absolutely not giving. Listen. Yes, there's the 3-act, 5-act structure. Yes, there's the hero's journey. Yes, there's all of those things. But in the end, those are the spinal columns or the templates that you fit things along. All I would say is get to know the character with 5 lily pads, because nothing will ever beat the frog, as far as I'm concerned. Your reader is a frog. There are 5 lily pads to cross the pond. The first lily pad is near the beginning of the book. It doesn't have to end up being the beginning. We don't know that till we've written the first draft, what the last draft's going to look like. How can we? But fill in the beginning in your first lily pad. Fill in the end in your last lily pad. Pick something that happens roughly in the middle and put that in the middle lily pad. And then fill in those other two that are sort of between 1 and 3 and between 3 and 5. And what you've got there is something to disagree with. You've got your journey for yourself, the writer, or for your reader to jump across the pond. But it's not there to be a slave to. It is there, like a rubber ring is, to be a bit of reassurance when you're floating around, but you get to change it all the time and any time. And then, and here's the really fun bit, you get to not present them in the right order and see what happens then. How does it change our experience?
Yeah.
Very intriguing.
Gosh, what would my advice be? Again, not advice, because nobody really knows.
Invitation, maybe.
My sort of habit comes in prequels, so I tell prequels. And we've talked before about foreshadowing. So maybe a good exercise, if not advice, would just be whatever happens in your story, your main story, go back and think of an event that happened in the past that maybe you've referred to. And think of it that way, like what came before or what comes very much after. If you're doing character development, this can be quite useful because your character is them now, but as we've discussed earlier on, we are an amalgamation of all of our past sort of experiences. If you're getting to know a character, write about something that happened to them when they were little. See how that affects them now. Why is that the thing that they are thinking about in this moment? You know, why is that the thing? What has contributed to them over time? I would say go back in time, work out what made them now.
Well, listeners, we hope you have a lot of fun playing around with time, and we are out of time in this podcast.
Oh, well done.
Pretty poor, that, wasn't it?
Oh, keep it.
I'll keep it anyway. I won't think of anything better. So, as always, Rachel Knightley, Emily Inkpen, thank you for joining us today.
Chris Gregory, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for listening to the Writer's Gym podcast with Rachel Knightley, Emily Inkpen, and me, Chris Gregory. If you'd like to learn more about Rachel and the Writer's Gym, please go to rachelknightley.com. To find out more about Emily, please go to emilyinkpen.com. And for Chris, go to alternativestories.com. We'll print all these links and more in the show notes for this podcast. The Writer's Gym podcast is an Alternative Stories 2024 production for The Writer's Gym. Production, sound design and editing were by me, Chris Gregory.